At the beginning of Being in Time, there's a frontispiece. That's a quote from Plato, from the Sophist. And the stranger, the Xenos, is speaking. And he says, "You've long been aware of what you mean when you say being. But those of us who thought we knew what it meant are now perplexed." And in many ways, this inaugurates the question of the meaning of being for Heidegger. But as we know, being has been understood as traditionally sensible and intelligible, real and ideal in many different ways, as essence or definition, substratum, etc., etc. In Aristotle, though, being comes to have a particular way of being understood. And it's traditionally understood as substance. Now, of course, this also has a number of different meanings, can be interpreted in different ways, and Brentano, for example, has 4 different understandings of Aristotelian substance, right? Accidental, true, potential and actual, or the categories. But in all of these, being is still understood as substance. The argument, however, is that when it comes to what being itself means, the argument is that being is not, for Aristotle, to be understood as a genus. Being is universal, because everything is, I, you, everything in the world is. And yet, being is not to be understood as a genus, and Aristotle has a particular argument for this, namely, that if being was a genus, then it couldn't be predicated of its proper differentia. Why? Because you would then need yet another genus that would encompass both the genus and the differentia. So being, for Aristotle, is a universal for all beings, but not a generic universal. So what is it? For Aristotle, he calls it an arche, an original universal. And it's this definition, or this understanding of being, that in many ways is the guiding understanding of being from the Greeks to modern philosophy, and many people today, in fact, still follow this understanding of being. But this history, if you will, shifts in Kant. When Kant comes along in modern philosophy and argues that being, yes, Aristotle was right, being is a universal, but being is not a real predicate. So being then is not substance. It's not essence. What is it? For Kant, it's not a real predicate, it's existence. That's what being means for Kant. Now, the question then becomes, okay, if being is, for Aristotle, not a genus, but essence or substance, and for Kant, not a predicate, but existence, what is the being of these beings? This is where Heidegger comes in. And Heidegger argues, being, yes, Aristotle and Kant are right, being is not a being. What is it? It's a universal, yes, they're right. What kind of universal? It's neither essence nor existence. It's the universal. Das Transzendenz schlechthin. It's the transcendental, if you will. Not, as the scholastics argued, unum verum bonum, but the universal transcendence. What is then the reason why this has never been seen before, as far as Heidegger is concerned? It's because the history of philosophy translated Aristotle's original understanding of being, which he called ousia, as substance, and then substantia, substance, etc., etc. So we remained in the history of philosophy wedded or loyal to this translation of ousia and couldn't see that this was actually a mistranslation, and the translation should have been presence. This is Heidegger's contribution, if you will, to the history of being. because he understands that being is presence. For example, he quotes Goethe. Over the mountains, everything is peaceful. Im Gipfeln alles ist Ruhe. Everything is peaceful in the mountains. Everything is peaceful in the mountains means that peace is in the mountains, peace reigns, peace prevails in the mountains. Peace is present in the mountains. That's what we mean by being. In other words, contra Parmenides in the entire history of philosophy, for Heidegger, being is that which is and also now that which is not. Because being, if it's present, if it's understood as presence, can also be understood as absence. And this is the second, if you will, contribution of Heidegger to the history of philosophy of being, namely that being is not just present or presence, but also absence or absent. So that being absent is a way of being, not merely a privation. This necessitates a destruction or deconstruction or destructuring of the history of philosophy for Heidegger, because it is the understanding of being as presence that has dominated the history of philosophy and stopped philosophy from thinking being also as absent, also as absence. For Heidegger, being is not just presence, as it was in Aristotle, but presence and absence. For example, Heidegger's example. If I say of my friend, he is not here, I miss him very much. What I mean is that he is not present, but he is absent, and yet he is also somehow present, namely present as absent. In this way, Heidegger wants to insist that being is determined as presence and absence. So the universality of being, if you will, that Aristotle originally uncovered is presence and absence in these two ways of being. And totium non datur. There is no third. But what does Aristotle say? Aristotle says being and unity imply one another. Why? Because being is implied. Being is implied in beings, not only in unity, but in beings, you and I, everything that is. Being is an implication. Being means then precisely neither being just present or absent. An example from Heidegger. A hint. When I give a hint about something, if it is to be a hint, it must remain a hint. If I explain, if I explicate the meaning of the hint, what is hinted at, it's no longer a hint. The issue is to remain with the hint as hinting. Same with implication. If I'm implying something, I'm precisely not bringing what is implied to presence, although nor am I leaving it simply in absence. Implications are then like hints. And this means that in the history of philosophy, like Poe's purloined letter, the meaning of being as implication has been staring us in the face. It's been in full view, even though we never saw it. Being means implying, and that is suspending the understanding of being as presence or absence. Thus, being is not implied because it's a universal. Being is a universal because it's implied. And this opens up, for us now, an entirely new area of ontological research, namely the investigation or the study of being qua implication.